there are a few pieces of this puzzle that we are assembling as we go along, which will include, because we've talked about digital audio, digital video, digital photography, archival printing, and the various codecs and file compression formats. And as we are putting this all toward an InDesign document, we'll have to start considering how do we actually start to lay these things out within a catalog. So we'll, over the next few classes, we'll be talking about not only layout, but considerations for color, as well as typography, as well as posters and other types of supporting material for a catalog or an exhibition. And so we talk about layout today. And I think I mentioned in here in an earlier class that when doing page layouts in the past, we actually were doing it with what they call galleries, which were printouts that were hard copy. And then using very, very big scissors, if you were working in a magazine, you would cut the columns out of those galleries, and it was destructive. In other words, once you cut that gallery, it was cut. And then you would be applying hot wax to the back of it, and then laying those columns into graph paper. So you would have a grid that would be set up for you, and then you would position not only the text, but the various images that you were going to use within those layout pages. And then we have to start talking about the color that you would want used in the publication as you went to the printer. Now, all of those elements can be pre-programmed in so that when you have your document completed, that you can assign the colors that you want. And then, as long as your monitor is calibrated to your camera, then what you send to the printer will print out in the exact color and in the exact flow that you have it laid out. And this is one of the wonderful things, because if you had, in the old days of analog printing, if you had to send your galleries on the layout page, say to China, or to some other place where they could be printed cheaper, and they got lost. They got lost. Where now, as you notice, anytime you do an InDesign project, there's a little file called .idd at the end. Right? That means that you have the original, and then you can back that up. So it's not only non-destructive, it's also savable, for example, now in cloud format. And when Seth was in here talking about cloud storage, such as with Dropbox and ways to increase your Dropbox, it is a really good thing to be using Dropbox, because it's backed up in many places around the world, and unless you're doing film, you can very easily use Dropbox for many of the projects that you are creating. So what we'll be talking about in the first part of today's lecture is that we're going to discover what the meaning of a layout is. That we have interconnected goals and functions of a layout, that we understand why we have to have these visual elements fitting into a limited physical space and have them function effectively. Now, one of the things about a limited physical space, too, is that we understand, and this is going to be different than the layout we looked at last week, 2 weeks ago. Because all the layout we were looking at was web pages, you remember? So this is layout for print now. Because the thing about web pages is that in web pages, white space and empty space isn't a waste. Because if the page turns off, you turn off the internet. And you can have people scroll. It's not a good idea to have people have to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll to get to the bottom of the page, because you get, what do they call it? I can't remember what happens when you, carpal tunnel. All right, so one of the things about when we're working in print, you do, even though it's on a computer, and it's gone when you turn it off. When this is printed out, it's on a limited visual space. The size of the page that someone's printing it out in, or the size of the screen you're viewing it on. Because we'll be doing it not only for print publication, but also for interactive PDF. And then we'll look at how a good layout actually does facilitate communication. So when you're walking around, even just around campus, and you start to pay attention to the various posters, the various messages that are out there that you can consume, right, visually, because they are meant to be perceived visually. Start to pay attention to what is it about those posters that draws your attention to it, that the designer has a message they want to communicate, and do they successfully do so? So if we look at these fundamental principles of the layout of the page, we want to emphasize focal point as well as visual hierarchy, as well as the unity, overall unity on the page, and balance. Now, focal point, you might say, is what is the first thing and what is the most important thing that you want to grab someone's attention? You might call it, and if it was the spoken word, it would be what is an attention grabber. If you've ever taken public speaking, you find that the very first sentence you say should be the thing that grabs someone by the ears and says, "This is important." So that's the focal point. And then the visual hierarchy. In other words, what are the elements? In essence, as you look at a page, you would rank in your own mind what you see in prioritizing what is the most important to what is the least important. That's a visual hierarchy. So we recognize also the importance of format in any layout. We think about using a grid as a layout device, and Adobe InDesign, as well as even Microsoft Word allows you to use a grid now. Microsoft Word has become, in many ways, a desktop publishing program that allows you now in newer versions to export what you do as an EPUB, right, as an ebook. So you're trying to keep track with their competitors, because Microsoft Office is a suite of programs. And they are trying to keep up in some ways with the suite of programs that Apple does, as well as with Adobe. That's why now in Microsoft Word you can export as a PDF. You couldn't do that in Word 2007 or 2003. And then how do we construct simple grids? So what is layout? It is the arrangement of the type and the visuals on a printed or a digital page. We look at the organization and arrangement of type, and we'll talk about type as a visual element in a later lecture. Where we look at the arrangement on two-dimensional surfaces to really facilitate, to enhance visual communication. So there are several goals that we want to achieve, and they are all interrelated. First, we know that we want to be able to fit everything onto that visual page. And this is where remember I talked about the way I shop. Is I grab everything I want and I throw it in the cart, and then when I get to the cashier, I say to myself, all right, what do I really need? And then I put the rest back. That's the same way we look at this, fitting things on a limited page. In my case, it's a limited budget, but in this case, a limited page. We want to arrange them so they are functional, they get the job done. So there should not be random acts of graphics. I've seen students go find clip art and put it on a page just because they felt like the page was empty. Wrong reason to throw a picture on a page. If it does not enhance, if it does not support what you're doing, don't use it. That they are unified. That people will actually, in their minds, group things together. And that they are easily accessible to the viewer. And that includes not only the size of the type that you use, it includes the color of the type you use, the spacing in the type, as well as the font itself. I've seen posters, for example, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in typography. Now, my cursive writing, as well as my print, really stinks. That's why the computer has saved my life. And generally, when I write things in print, I do it in all caps, because that's the greatest chance I'll know what I wrote an hour later, and someone else will know too. But I've seen people do posters using a cursive font or typeface, or the really fancy ones. In my opinion, when you are doing this for print, it belongs in only one kind of publication. RSVP. Invitations. In my opinion, that's the only place this type of typeface or font should be used.
Are there any other formal publications that you would recommend other than invitations? No brochures?
Using a cursive?
I mean, does it have to be in box paper? Does it have to be formal?
I would use it anywhere but formal myself. It's more difficult to read, for one. But I've seen whole posters laid out using a cursive font. And that's too much work for me. All right, I want to see it in 4 letters, RSVP. All right, and then they can try to read my chicken scratch response that I'll be there or not. That's too much work. And when we're looking at visual impact, when a reader has to work to receive the message, we're lazy. That's why it's important when we looked at web pages last week. I think I mentioned this. Have you ever gone to a web page and it's nothing but text? No visual candy? I don't know about you, that drives me right out of my mind. If I want that, I'm going to go to a book because it's what I expect. Like on a web page, you don't want that. A catalog, you don't want that. And if you do have it, it's at a place that people understand, such as with a curator statement or a contributing essay. People understand that's what it's going to be about. Otherwise, we want to make sure that when we are facilitating visual communication and its interrelationship of text and images, we want to keep things accessible. We want it to be easy. We want people to actually read the catalog, for example, or spend some time lingering on posters. There are some posters I've seen that I stood there and I looked at for several minutes because they actually knocked me out. To this day, the images are burned into my brain. You could show me a picture and I could tell you the event. So the basic principles operating in layout. When we are designing a page, we want to keep in mind the emphasis, the focal point and visual hierarchy, the unity and the balance. What do you see as the focal point in this layout of a page? I apologize that the light tends to wash this screen out. Visually, what are your eyes drawn to immediately? The what? The lettering at the top. This is one of those cases, I would argue, actually, that typography actually took precedence. And yet, if you stop for a second and you really look at the whole poster, because the first thing you register is light. But then, generally, the next thing that we focus on will be an elephant with a person standing on his head, on the elephant's head. Some of us may actually have seen this first. the elephant, and the acrobat. But we look at that as part of the emphasis. What is it that we focus on initially? Now, there are ways creatively, and this is one of the differences between doing a poster as compared to doing a photograph. Because when we are doing photography, we want to keep things visually interesting. And one of the ways to do that, I'm not sure if Richard talked about it, or probably mentioned it, what we call the rule of thirds. Not yet? Okay, I'll talk about that either on Wednesday or Monday. But how do we, with the photograph, when we photograph people, for example, I'll just give you a preview. There is a tendency to want to put the person in the dead center of the photograph. Try not to do that. Unless it's your photograph for your yearbook. It's your high school. And generally, it's a bus shot. That's when we want people dead center. When you want to create something visually interesting, it's good to have the person in a context or doing something. So actually try to have the person away from the middle to either one side or other. If you think of the picture being divided into three columns, either the left column or the right column with a visual context. And then we'll look at that here, and some of that will appear here. Also a unity. We have a unity in the way that Alright? By columns, we have two figures here stacked. Two figures here stacked. Text stacked. And that stacked with another figure and text. That's when we look at unity. This isn't a random act of layout. The person thought visually, how do they want us to think about this? Most people aren't thinking about it, unless you're a graphic designer. And then even the balance that we see of not only something being justified centered, but then you'll see that it's ragged left, text here, centered here, but we have this element actually balanced against this element. We have him literally balanced on the elephant. That's kind of a visual pun. And that's one of the wonderful things, too, is when we have these types of visual puns. Because the designer actually had to be thinking about balance and then had to have been tickled with the way they showed it visually. One of your assignments in here will be a poster. So keep this in mind when you design a poster. Format. That is the primary player in any layout. How are we formatting the elements? How are we formatting the page? What this person has done, and I think somewhat successfully in one sense and unsuccessfully in another. Because what this person is trying to do in the formatting of the text, is trying to get you to actually read it in a clockwise manner. What word do you see here? What was it? Frightened. This shows you that there was a disconnect here. Because it actually is Fritz. Because you see the F here, you can tell the R-I-T, but we are lazy. And we don't want to turn the N over. I'm not saying you're lazy, all right? Because the first time I read it, I saw frightened too. So this person was successful all the way to 6 o'clock. All right, by the time we got to 9 o'clock, I dozed. All right, and I saw frightened. And I thought, what the hell is frightened? That's an interesting way to spell frightened. Or fritten. All right, so what's a fritten? All right, all right, and then the only way that I actually was able to perceive the image, and you can't see it very well here, is that the artist's name is Fritz. You actually saw the. That's interesting, all right, because generally, if we look at the hierarchy and the focal point, all right, it's the block lettering. And it's done to fit within the shape of a page. So what this person has done is created a circular or a clockwise layout within a rectangular format.
Maybe it would have helped if they used some lines. Maybe if they put a line from the F straight down and then across towards the Z. It might help your eyes follow it better.
Yeah,
Horrible design.
it's an interesting concept to think about how you can improve that. And so, and then this is one of the ways that really, if you go into any type of design, look at what other people are doing. We've got hundreds of magazines on campus. It's not random access layout.
Or they could have added like a background spiral.
That may have done it, sure, but then they also have caused you to focus on
Yeah, you're right.
And that's one of the wonderful things about doing this digitally now, is that all you got to do is hit Command Z, and whatever you did can be undone. And it's why it's a good idea to save several times with different file names of the same version. And so IDB Project 1.1, Project 1.2, so you have a running log of each thing that you try. And once again, in the old days, to achieve this, you got the galley,
So you think it's a
and you
good
had to cut all the letters out, paste them on. Go ahead.
You think it's a good idea to save your junk ideas and then go back to them later?
I'm a child of the Depression era.
Okay.
I save all junk.
Oh my
You
goodness.
just never know when you're going to need it. My family used to tease my father and I because we're the only people that would go to a junkyard and come away with more than we brought. So really, in any design problem, you try to conceive the idea and realize it visually. It does not hurt to actually, even if it's just a quick pencil, scratch out on a piece of paper a rough grid and try messing with, and you don't have to write the text out. You just know that this is the text block you're going to use. But think about if you've got two images that you're going to have on a catalog page, and you don't want it to be repetitive, because we're lazy, but we also want people to keep things interesting for us. So we're lazy and bored. So how do you as a designer keep things visually interesting? So you want to actually create, select, and organize these elements, text, color, images, and type, or I said text and typography, to create effective communication. Often without using complete sentences. When you think about it on posters, probably 70% of posters that you see do not have complete sentences on them. And we have become culturally conditioned in posters to understand. You see a poster and it says November 17th, 2013.
Our brains are mnemonically trained to know that's the date.
That's the day it's going to happen, all right? You don't see a complete sentence that says, the concert will be held at 8 p.m. on November 17th, 2013. We actually do a lot of filling in information. We plan on that in posters. So some of the layout problems that we're going to encounter, and that's why I know the InDesign book that you're using can be frustrating, but it causes you to have to think about these things. Right now, I would say, what's that, subconsciously? Because as we're looking at the fake magazine layouts and we're looking at text and images, that there was an intended design there. And even the frustration, for example, that Arlene encountered when she was trying to work the letters in the last assignment, I think it was IDE 4, you had to work the But then other problems are going to be when you have multi-page designs. How do you keep something so it maintains all those elements, including balance, unity, such as books, magazines, newspapers, brochures. We'll also be doing a very brief brochure for this project, websites, and annual reports. Because the layout of an annual report is going to look very different from a brochure, and very different from a magazine. Are you all able to see the lines, all right? So try to think of the page, because the page is a rectangle, and think of it as a grid. And a grid is really helpful when you're trying to look at all of those elements: balance, emphasis, rhythm, and unity. We talked about rhythm in an earlier presentation. And what that grid does is it provides you with a guide. It gives you a structure of verticals and horizontals that allow you to divide what you are doing in the columns and margins. You can even further subdivide with guides and InDesign and other desktop publishing programs, as you can even have moving guides that allow you to pull from a ruler. It's like an invisible line down to part of the page to say, all right, here's where I want my photograph to fit, and I want to make sure that it's in the same alignment as the opposing page, but in a different orientation. So even within the grid that is laid out in your page, you can further subdivide it. One of the things that's always astounded me, in one way, and yet made perfect sense as another, I have a real passion in art history for textiles. And the oldest continuous textile tradition in the world actually is in this hemisphere, and it's in South America. Textiles that precede anything in Asia, where a lot of the oldest artistic traditions are. In textiles, this hemisphere has the oldest. And looking not only at the textile designs that are figurative or pictorial, not only in South America, but in Central and North America, but also in designs that are geometric. And I have a real passion in North America for Navajo textiles. And it has always amazed me that when I've gone, for example, to Clara Sherman, when I used to see her weave, or Virginia Beale, they're from Fort Leon, and watch them in front of the loom. And none of the textiles that are woven are alike. Yet you can tell the hand of the person who wove it. And it's all coming off the top of this person's head. You might think. But actually, the loom itself is grid. if you have a certain number of warp threads. That sets up columns, and your weft creates the grid. So it's really, even in doing layout for a text file, and then when we look at the really amazing visual imagery that are done in text files. So the geometric stuff, for me, is really easy to comprehend. Oh yeah, there's a grid there. But when I look at some of the pictorial elements that are done, there's her name, her last name, I think is Riggs, and I can't remember her first name. Did a text file, it's called Jurassic, and it's dinosaurs done in handling dyed yarns. Blew my mind. Looking at T-Rex and the Brontosaurus done in weaving. Pictorial. And looking at the weaving itself, achieving these elements. The person is still thinking, to some degree, in a grid. If we were to take this simple page, and we now further subdivide the first grid, we'll say two-page layout with two columns. In essence, this is a one column. All right, once we transform that, so we've taken the page and turned the one column now into two columns, so that we have 4 columns total over the two-page spread. And then we further subdivide and then visually within this, we can still do different types of transformations without adding any more columns. Actually, once you get any more than 4 columns per page, you're going to create confusion for the viewer. If you're using text, the text size will have to be too small for a person to really be able to read effectively. So when you see even in a 4-column page layout, that an image may stretch across 2 of those columns. Or maybe even 3 of those columns.
Do you also have to consider the spacing between each column?
Yes.
Because when you put your picture up, sometimes it still could be off if you don't consider those spaces.
Yeah, that's why you can, when you're laying pictures out, you can actually have it so the picture will, in essence, fit to the grid. Or you can have it free flow. In essence, what it does, rather than a bleed over into your margin, it will bleed into the column space. So if we look at examples of the grid and how it can operate in over several pages, we see a 2-column layout spread across a 2-page layout. Here, in primacy, we see the who needs advertising, and then the way that it was done to make it somewhat interesting, because if the person was to put advertising across, it would take the whole 2 columns. So they did something visually interesting. They worked the text. So now you read it, and you still, even though you got to work just a little bit, it's thought-provoking enough that we'll say, oh gosh, what does that say? And it's wrapped around an image. Here, we have the text wrapped around an image. We have text wrapped around text. Text wrapped around an image, even in such a way when we're talking about how we could violate the space in between columns. This is what it's done. We haven't made it snap to guides. And in this case, we're looking at it wrapping in a balanced manner and is maintaining the shape of a rectangle or square, where you'll note the text wrap around here is ragged right and ragged left in order to wrap around that graphic. And the challenge being, which is easier when it wraps around a rectangular graphic or a square graphic, is because you anticipate it and you actually see this as a margin. So your eyes will more easily dance across the text. As compared to here, there's a little bit more work because it's ragged with an image competing with the text. Or you may be designing without a grid. I think some of the most effective posters are done without a grid. It's hard work to read a book that is done completely without column or grid format. And even in one of the ways that I noticed this, this would have been back in the late 60s during a movement that was known as the Yippies. The Yippies in 1968 were led by Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, and they were kind of the anti-hippie movement. They were still hairbags. They were still, you might say, somewhat revolutionary, but they were also anarchistic. And they actually interrupted the Chicago National Democratic Convention. They did a lot of outrageous things. They appointed a pig to run for president. They showed up with various canvassing bidders, and they set up a table outside the convention where you could pay $200 a plate to talk with the various candidates, and they were handing out free bologna sandwiches, saying, "Why go pay $200 to listen to bologna when you can get it here for free?" They're doing all this crazy stuff. They actually got arrested. There was a trial for the Chicago 7, who included Black Panthers people, as well as Hoffman and Rubin. And Jerry Rubin wrote a book called Do It, which was a hilarious book, but it was hard to read because it was totally unconventional in its layout, and you really had to work to read it. But what he did, he had enough funny stuff in it that kept you wanting to read it, kept you paying attention to it. But you'll note that when we think about success in layout, right, if you were looking at this on a printed page, in general, this would be too much work. The person tried to do it non-conventionally, I would say they failed. It's too miscellaneous. Of course, it's in Italian, so when we're trying to solve any graphic design problem, we've got to think of an idea and try to realize it visually. It does not hurt to actually sit down with a piece of paper and create a thumbnail sketch. You don't have to write all the text in, you don't have to draw the pictures, you just have to approximate shapes and sizes of text columns and images. In text columns, that also includes titles. That our layout looks at the arrangement then of the type and visuals, and type is a visual. On the printed digital page, we look at the arrangement of type on two-dimensional surfaces to create effective visual communications. And I'm doing this on Camtasia, so this, if it uploads quickly, it should be available by this afternoon. Okay, we have interrelated goals. We're fitting the elements into a limited space. This is just a recap of what we talked about earlier. We want to be functional, unified, accessible. And to have a lasting visual impact. Okay, we want to think about focal points, visual hierarchy, unity, and balance, and format is the primary player. Think about our formatting, and that is why it's so important to do the thumbnails ahead of time. Any elements are going to respond to the shape of the page. In a multi-page document, you can still begin with a single page and think about that page as a poster or an advertisement. If you do that, that single page might be the very first page of the document. And you are going to be working on a multi-page document. They were supposed to photograph in the raw exhibit in high quality. I'm still trying to find out from Craig if they actually did so. If they did not, Russell Stallman's got some images that we're going to work with, because that part of the catalog you're designing is going to be in the raw exhibit select pieces from that you'll be doing the catalog for. And you're using many elements, and you want to still maintain that balance, rhythm, unity. It's a good idea to use the grid. We're thinking about columns and margins, and how we can, when we violate, because columns, margins, and the grid are rules. How do we violate those rules in visually interesting and engaging ways?